Rock operas aren't exactly an unexplored concept in punk, and concept albums especially aren't. Releasing two back-to-back isn't an unknown situation either, even in punk, so on the face of it, it's not the weirdest thing in the world that Green Day would follow up their opera with another apparent opera, or at least narrative concept album. 21st Century Breakdown was really the first album I encountered where I set it apart piece by piece and thought that the thing that the pieces make should be something I love, but as a whole, something about the final album is, to me, in my subjective opinion, pretty bad. And I've spent a long time trying to understand what it is about this album that makes it the way it is. There are multiple lenses to view this through, multiple avenues to take in trying to figure this thing out. So inherently this will get a touch speculative. There's no way to know for sure why this album is the way it is. But we have the music, we have some interviews, and we have Green Day's back catalog and some extra music to boot. So today I want to take a crack at figuring out what this album is and why it is, what it does well, what it does poorly, and how it can be looked at and valued in different ways. So if aggressively analytical discussions and pointless speculation are your thing, you've come to the right exhaustingly long video. American Idiot released in 2004 and 21st Century Breakdown in 2009, 5 years being the longest gap between Green Day records, which still hasn't been broken. Green Day weren't totally inactive apart from that. They did put out a short side project in 2008, but considering Armstrong released something almost every year from 1990 to 2004, that isn't necessarily saying much. Apparently they'd been working on this album since January 2006, and it was recorded through 2008 and early 2009, coming out May of the 4th year of production. For comparison, prior Green Day albums were written and recorded in between less than a year to about 2 years. American Idiot being a special case, since the first 20-ish songs of that were totally set aside when they changed direction from a Nimrod-style pop-punk album to an opera. So pretty much an entire album was kind of unexisted around the middle of the 3 or 4 years of writing and production. And while 1997's Nimrod equaled 21st Century Breakdown's track count at 18, 21st Century Breakdown was their longest album to date. Coming in at 70 minutes, it pretty much reached the limit of how much music a studio would put on a CD, and it beat American Idiot at its 58-minute runtime. 21st Century Breakdown was longer and took longer to make than every other Green Day release, before and since. Unless you count the trilogy as one record, then that's almost twice as long as a runtime, but it was written in, I think, 2 years, but don't quote me on that. This is a lot of numbers, and it might not seem very important, but I want to establish all this to back up my stance that Green Day took this album very seriously and probably worked hard on it. It's totally possible that they just sat around for 3 years and then shoved out this album in less than a year and just lied about how long it took. I think that's a totally valid theory to hold about this album, and it gives an easy answer to why it is the way it is. It's bad because Green Day shoved out 18 songs in 70 minutes at the last minute. They phoned it in, but I'll leave that theory here. It's because part of me doubts that Armstrong would lie about writing 45 songs.
Armstrong said in an interview with Rolling Stone that he had written something like 45 songs.
Armstrong stated, "I want to dig into who I am and what I'm feeling at this moment, which is middle-aged." He added that many of the 45 songs were written on piano rather than guitar.
It wasn't weird for Green Day to throw out 5 or so songs from demos to the final product, but over twice as many songs as were on the final album feels like a weird lie. Feels like a weirdly bombastic and expansive lie. What it says to me is that Green Day spent that time being perfectionists, as always. And the theory about 21st Century Breakdown that I find a lot more interesting is that it's the product of overthinking, not underthinking. You could say that the trilogy is what you get when you underthink songs, and 21st Century Breakdown is what you get when a band of meticulous perfectionists overthink and hype themselves up against a standard to match their previous rock opera until they end up with 45 demos, and they have to somehow get from 45 demos to an album. Somewhere in the process of writing 21st Century Breakdown, Green Day made a cover of a Who song, a quick one while he's away, and I think it serves as a great comparison to the album and a great jumping off point for discussing it. The original song is about 9 minutes, and the Green Day cover is about 8 minutes. Overall, it's compositionally similar. It changes some of the little flares and little details in the background, and it cuts out an iffy verse about sexual misconduct, but on the whole, if you just play it sometime, not a lot sticks out. You need to play them side by side or know one really well by heart to see most of those changes. But there is a big, weird change to it that makes the way they approach the song really stand out. The last act of this little rock opera, starting with when they sing cello, lasts 2 minutes in the original and 3 minutes in the cover. That's a 67% increase in length. and the thought process behind that is what led me to a big realization about 21st Century Breakdown. The original Quick One While He's Away is a meandering, disorganized, relaxed, easygoing song, an easygoing opera. It's really in line with The Who's catalog and that era of pop rock in general, and even rock as a whole then. It got easily distracted with instrumental breakoffs, it revved up only to unwind again and take a second to relax. Even the less popular, harder, and more intricate music transformed that downtime and breathing room by pumping it with an impressive amount of instrumentals and cramming as much into that downtime as possible. The cover of A Quick One tightens up that composition. It picks up the tempo, it removes those relaxed, gratuitous breathing moments. It's a song very concerned with being efficient and keeping the momentum up, more concerned with tying the momentum between its acts together rather than that one act fade into another like an entirely different song. This makes a lot of sense to me. The cover plays like Homecoming, stylistically disconnected segments that are fused together by sheer momentum throughout its parts, even to the point that it borrows the excessive repeating and the last act of the song from Homecoming to better nail the climax and the end of the song with some finality. The cover is a tighter, more energetic, and more lively song in every way, and it makes a more enthralling end product, but I'll always enjoy the original more. The original is relaxed and meandering and gratuitous, and it's really, really sloppy. It's classic rock. It's everything charming about that era and genre. While the cover tightened everything up, it loses that telltale, easygoing energy of classic pop, and gives up that chance at self-indulgent but excellent musicianship, and it becomes something that's really, really a lot more focused, a lot faster, a lot more cohesive as a singular song, but it feels, in turn, like less focused, less ferocious pop punk. The cover is more on brand for Green Day, but it's also pretty bad at being classic rock. And it ends up feeling like Green Day going for a generalized, generic, faster rock sound with hints of classic rock for flavoring rather than an authentic classic rock. Now that we have that established, I think we can tie it to the album itself. Across the runtime, 21st Century Breakdown feels like it's struggling to find the common ground between Green Day and classic pop rock. And for the sake of this, we're going to treat the lazier, more wandering classic rock that developed into prog rock as its one thing, and we're going to call that classic rock. And we'll call the classic rock that was rougher and faster and developed into garage rock as a separate classic rock, and we'll just leave that over there. Both because Green Day's done garage rock a few times, and they've shown that their stylistic approaches are pretty different between those outings and this one, and I think that Green Day probably conceptualized them as different things. They take a different conceptual approach to writing a classic garage rock album than they do with this classic rock, prog rock inspired magnum opus. And because musically, I think that the garage rock half of classic rock isn't far removed from what Green Day normally does, and it isn't far removed from punk in general, so we'll simplify, we'll round some decimals off, and we'll say for the sake of this video, classic rock and classic pop are this half of it. So when Green Day says stuff like this,
Cole has remarked it is important to us that we're still looked at as a punk band. It was our religion, our higher education. However, he also noted that Armstrong had delved into the past in writing 21st Century Breakdown, gleaning inspiration from the artists who shaped rock music. Armstrong himself has stated, "Ground zero for me is still punk rock. I like painting an ugly picture. I get something uplifting out of singing some of the most horrifying shit you can sing about. It's just my DNA."
we can gather that they aren't talking about punk from a compositional perspective, they mean the ethos of punk, the ideology and the attitude. That follows how 21st Century Breakdown is compositionally. Its more ferocious songs can be seen as punk in ethos, but they don't fit a lot of what we associate with punk as a genre. Not in many of the tropes, many of the compositional approaches, especially not the fast melodic version that Green Day had been doing. And if the goal of this album was to explore a wider classic influence while still being punk, the cover might have been a learning moment there. A first step to unchaining the Green Day sound from the faster, rougher sound. Green Day doing wild classic rock feels very familiar, very in their wheelhouse, and very Green Day, because they always took inspiration from that music anyway. It isn't experimental or groundbreaking for them to do that anymore. My assumption for this album is that Green Day were being perfectionists. They repeatedly said in interviews and in media and all that this album was inspired by a wider range of classic rock influences, so it follows to me that leaving the same musical style behind for one more reminiscent of a wider range of classic rock was the main goal of the album, compositionally at least, to take the next step from a quick one and bridge that stylistic gap, to not sound like Green Day doing a classic rock flavor, but to sound like authentic classic rock. This brave new direction makes sense, considering they probably just exhausted a lot of their more familiar inspiration, both on the failed pop-punk album that they threw out, then going straight into putting all their energy into a rock opera. So this kind of plays out like getting a chance to kind of branch out and do something different, but also at the same same time staying in line with that leap from Nimrod to Warning and Warning to American Idiot, but on a much larger scale. The next logical step for a perfectionist band, to stop homaging the past like they had for a few albums, and to finally write something that feels authentic to it. Across the album, I'm not sure they're able to escape the quick win issue, at least not consistently, that loss of identity and marrying the two very different styles. To me, there are generally three types of songs on the record. There are songs that skew to Green Day and play similarly to American Idiot or Warning. They're more fast-paced and punchy and incorporate wider influences into the Green Day framework like those albums did. Next, there are songs that skew to classic rock. The hallmark of these is their slower, more meandering pace, and their willingness to experiment with a more ambitious guitar line and play with tempo and less traditional verse-chorus structures. And last, there are the in-betweens, a sort of uncanny valley where the influences don't mix evenly, and you get lumps of one style and a smooth layer of the other, setting off the flow and identity of the song. These are the songs that feel the most frustrating to discuss to me. They'll take a pop-punk hook, but they'll repeat it way too much, like it's pretending to be a long, showy classic guitar line, or they'll take a melody that wants to decompress and wander and unwind, but they'll ramp it up and force it into a punk tempo. Of course, the most complicated thing about this album is even though this pattern is there, it's not all or nothing. Every song kind of sits somewhere on this graph between extremes, like East Jesus Nowhere. It's a slower, show tunes and blues-inspired song that tries to have the classic guitar solo, but the guitar line is more akin to Last of the American Girls or another pop-punk song. So a lot of the song wants to fit into the more loose classic mold, but it's just barely off. I think a lot of the listeners' enjoyment of 21st Century Breakdown will come to how important the composition of an entire song is versus how important each moment and singular occurrence is. If you want a song that grows and changes in a satisfying, interesting way, Last of the American Girls might be way too long and a little boring for you, but if you can sink into that basic bass line and just take the guitar moments as they come, and then you might not worry about that. And I can see how someone can think it's an absolute bop. To get a little speculative, I think the source of the issues here probably ties back to that perfectionist mindset. These songs need to be the absolute best they can be, and as a Green Day record, they need to do it like how they do on a quick one. They need to trim out gratuitous, self-indulgent moments and make a lean and efficient record, like the previous Green Day records. But they also need to achieve that classic rock sound somehow. That style needs to come from somewhere, so they need to get gratuitous and slower and more relaxed. But that comes back into conflict with needing to be efficient and trimmed down. It's self-contradictory. It's an album that wants to cannibalize itself for the sake of being an amazing record. It wants to stretch out its run times because that runtime is what that kind of classic melody demands, but then it sucks out the parts that would make those run times earned because they are technically less efficient. I think 21 Guns shines as the album's standout track because it almost feels like the only song that's allowed to unwind, to fill itself with negative space. It has a very deliberate guitar line, careful silence that contrasts with moments of intensity. 21 Guns by far feels the most like a classic rock song, not in aesthetic, but in its flow and energy. It's a slow, unwinding classic rock song with moments of punk intensity, exactly what Green Day wanted the album to be. They just let it be, and it worked well. The album's most generic songs, like Peacemaker or Christian's Inferno, have less going on musically because they tried too hard to add more. Then to balance it back out and have it still work, they add more, balance it back out. Peacemaker might be the most generic European folk/American spaghetti western song I've ever heard on a high-charting album, but I think it's accidentally ended up as generic. It probably began as a lot more like Misery, but was pulled back and forth until only the most generic bass and guitar lines remained, because they were inoffensive enough to fit both angles that the song wanted to measure up to. This genericness, cooked into a lot of the songs from this attempt to compromise, isn't helped by the mastering. It's some of the most utilitarian mastering you can find, a little on the polished side, but for the most part it feels like mastering that doesn't want to be noticed. It doesn't want to contribute to the energy of the songs, it just wants to be there. And the issue with that is that it's pretty much impossible. The way music is mixed and mastered affects how you hear it, unlike how the framing of a camera shot affects how you see a movie or show. And just like how a basic shot-reverse shot can't be invisible, and it actually works to make a visual medium feel a little more generic, this nondescript mastering adds to the nondescript genre of the songs themselves, snowballing onto that genericness. That being said, the unnoticeable mastering means it also isn't technically as much of a problem here as on other Green Day records. Some of their releases are really solidly cooked apart from the mastering and can really be helped with little changes to the mastering, but this isn't one of those. Even with the improvements to the mastering, the foundational issues on these songs are still there. This theme of accidental, vague genre is probably why this album clocks as emo for a lot of people, or at least played a big role in their emo phases. Armstrong's poetic, emotional, classic rock lyrics are pretty unaffected by the sandpapering of the music, and the punk ethos is still at least trying to be there. This anger and the sensitivity mixes in a way that works pretty well for emo. Since the conflicting inspirations of the music wore each other away, they leave a more generic, emotional rock sound, and that happens to fit emo pretty well too. 21st Century Breakdown doesn't achieve a lot in terms of classic rock for me, but it does end up pretty perfectly as an accidental emo album. Ends up as a lyric-driven pop record with some pretty uninteresting instrumentals, but some admittedly punchy melodies here and there. I don't think the instrumentals of Murder City or Little Girl are all that interesting, but they still hold an energy to them, the way mainstream pop can strike lucky with an energetic flow, even if its instrumentals are really mediocre or worse. As a classic rock album, 21st Century Breakdown is probably a failure. Panning out to the wider lens of rock composition in general, the same issues drag it down pretty far. But an album isn't just the music. 21st Century Breakdown is at least a concept album and at most maybe an opera, so we can take some time to focus on that.
21st Century Breakdown continues the rock opera style of its predecessor, American Idiot. The album is set in Detroit, Michigan, and is divided into 3 acts: Heroes and Cons, Charlatans and Saints, and Horseshoes and Hand Grenades. Its loose narrative follows a young couple named Christian and Gloria through the challenges present in the U.S. following the presidency of George W. Bush. Bassist Mike Dirnt has compared the relationships between the songs to those in Bruce Springsteen's Born to Run, saying that the themes are not as tightly interwoven as in a concept album, but that they are still connected.
This will be the most subjective part of this video. I'll get a little high school English class here, so you've been warned, feel free to skip to the next section. The presence of some sort of narrative seems to be the most important component of 21st Century Breakdown. Armstrong kept the lyrics a secret till the end.
Armstrong kept his lyrics closely guarded and intentionally mixed his demos so that the vocals were low in the mix and thus unintelligible to the other band members. It was not until late 2008 that he chose to share his words with cool, Vig, and bassist Mike Dirnt by sitting down with them and reading the entire album's lyrics aloud in order.
To me, that implies the message of his lyrics were so important he was willing to sacrifice instrumentals to ensure the lyrics were perfect. I mean, I assume it was harder for Cool and Dirnt to write, not knowing what the song was exactly about. I'm sure the guitar line probably helped, and Armstrong probably gave them a mood or a general vibe, but I can't imagine it was the easiest process for them. This album is divided into 3 acts. Vocal, musical, and thematic motifs repeat on this album again and again. According and agreeing with the 3-act structure, we're given protagonists, Christian and Gloria, who Armstrong characterized are based on a duality in himself. Gloria, the part of him who wants to hold on to belief, and Christian, the part of him deep into his own demons and victimizing himself. These characters seem to be named just as often as the Jesus of Suburbia or St. Jimmy, but despite that, the actual storytelling on this album, the characters, the setting, events of the plot, inciting incident, rising events, falling events, climax, resolution, all the cornerstone elements of what make a story, which were present on American Idiot, are mostly or totally absent here. The title track immediately presents the first struggle in taking anything said on this album literally, and I know Armstrong said this song directly talks about some things about him and his family, but he's also said this is a story, and as a chapter, and especially as an early chapter in a story, it makes sense that it should contribute to it. The first half of the song takes a perspective of someone Armstrong's age, born under Nixon, the youngest son of a socialist trucker, the first to leave home. We learn a lot about this person, and it feels kind of like a clean and direct introduction to our protagonist, but then we shift to another perspective, someone around at that time 12 or 14 years old, just starting to approach adulthood in the middle of economic recession, raised by a bastard the age of the first storyteller. Depending on how you read the lyrics, the song's meaning can vary wildly. Maybe the protagonist Christian is one of these 2 people. Maybe this is Armstrong setting the stage in his perspective, kind of like Homer's plea to the Muses at the start of the Iliad and the Odyssey. Maybe these are fictional people, but neither are the characters, and it's just a random slice of America America in 2008 to set the atmosphere before meeting our protagonists. A similar issue continues in looking at the lyrics for characterization, assuming that this is Christian or a main character. Maybe Christian hates the establishment, and all the things that he sings about here are done sarcastically just to scorn them. Maybe Christian is an honest Christian through and through, and this song is just him at surface level, sung with this bit of sarcasm because Armstrong has a sarcastic take on this person. I won't go through every song like this, but this kind of songwriting persists throughout the album and is pretty much its default approach. Christian is an incredibly metaled rendering on this record. Songs like Before the Lobotomy and Christian's Inferno continue with similar language. Is Christian a conservative, pining for the glory days of the 1940s to 50s? Is he an immigrant with close emotional ties to his distant family and relatives? Is he lost like a refugee because he and his family has been there? Or because immigration is on his mind as a caring Christian wanting to take care of the fellow poor and needy? Or is it more like a deep-fried fundamentalist Christian hating that he could fall so low as to resemble people like that? Depending on the conclusion about him you make at the start of the record, the songs about him can all play out drastically differently. Take one of these interpretations and go through the lyrics and see how well it lines up, then take another interpretation and compare them, and it can be kind of difficult to tell which is the correct one. None of them necessarily work out more clearly or easily than the others. There are anti-Christian messages on this album, especially East Jesus Nowhere, but Armstrong wrote that during a baptism, and it kind of stands as a mouthpiece directly from him. So what does this mean to the album? Is this story a story of an atheist being crushed by conservative America? Is it a story of a Christian struggling to keep or even losing his faith with sarcasm and denial? Is it a satirical story of the type of Christian that Armstrong probably feels is ruining America? I mean, knowing what I do about Armstrong, there's one explanation that I lean to more than the others, but if I don't say which one it is, I'd assume that everyone who watches this video might guess that I'm guessing a different answer, and that's kind of the point I'm trying to make. Compared to Christian, we get a much clearer picture of Gloria. Thanks to this, she ends up feeling a little more like a true protagonist, with Christian becoming more of a supporting character. She narratively embodies youthfulness and a young blood punk spirit, though she might not necessarily be young or younger than Christian. This kind of goes along with a bit more naivety in her characterization, or at least less real-world experience, and more of a youthful and innocent determination and ability to hold on to beliefs. She isn't the one with cracked hands and years to testify, but she's a conspirator, a rebel, an anarchist, and a thrill-seeking criminal with a thing for other thrill-seeking criminals. The passion she embodies, her pure idealized philosophy, and a possible lack of experience all kind of signal a college student or maybe high school student, or at least someone who's preserved that identity into adulthood. She's concerned with the environment, with animals, is pretty anti-authoritarian, anti-establishment, which all kind of ties into a picture of a person further down the left. And the possible Latina heritage that the Latin motifs around her on the album kind of also fits with that stereotype. All of this kind of first makes me think that Christian would be the same, that these two would have kind of matching personalities, but the album has repeating themes of duality and conflict, and the two seem to have a turbulent relationship throughout the album, so I don't think that that's a sure thing. The album suggests that they have a deep love for each other, and that they seem to have turbulent periods where they're against each other. Maybe. It's also possible that the narrator is trying to portray an internal self-doubt through songs like Restless Heart Syndrome, Murder City, Little Girl. Again, that's kind of up to you to interpret. If nothing else, the 21 Guns music video seems to suggest some kind of reunion between the two, implying they were apart from or against each other, but music videos don't always accurately match the song, so who am I to say? This broken-up style of lyricism, where it's kind of hard to tell what the characters think, apart from what they do in the story, and apart from a more meta, out-of-character narration of the world, is all kind of pretty chaotic. But that has its benefits too. 21st Century Breakdown at least makes it clear that in 2008 to 2009, the country was currently a flaming dumpster fire. Sometimes the chaos is painted with a distinctly Christian tone, sometimes it's consumerism and the bloat and misinformation of media in general in the information age, yet sometimes it's the sheer volume of conflicting voices and opinions that are to blame. This album is against authority. It's against the static age. It's against Baptists. But what does it really mean to be against those things? What does it actually stand for, and what does it believe is good? This album doesn't provide solutions. It shows a world that's suffocating and destroying its protagonists, and implies that they aren't compatible with the breaking down 21st century world. Is there a solution? Is this album a hopeless doomer declaration that life is pointless and we should just wait it out and make a mess until the end of the world? Or is it trying to encourage some sort of shared anger or rage against the system to encourage a collective change? Then what made the system corrupt? What kind of change does it want to encourage? What will fix it? Bring this back to Christian. Even if one of these Christians is the correct Christian, what does that leave? A spiteful caricature of Christians that doesn't say anything specifically about why what they think is bad, not how to oppose them, nothing about how maybe to help them. A directionless rebel who hates the concept of authority, but in such an abstract way that it doesn't really say anything more than a generic pop-punk song would. A lefty who thinks all the same things as Armstrong but never explains himself, who never has a belief questioned, who just gets to spout his opinion for the audience to nod along for an hour and not really think about. I don't know. All of these kind of feel like a missed opportunity to me. It's normal for concept albums and even rock operas to be vague and let the emotions take the wheel, but the overwhelming vagueness of most of the songs on here makes me wonder what the message is supposed to be. Maybe it's as simple as, hey, do you feel like the world's a dumpster fire right now? Yep, same here. Let's cry about it together. Part of me thinks that's all this album is supposed to be, that it's supposed to be directionless and up to interpretation, but the rest of me doubts that Armstrong would leave it at that. Considering his character, it feels more like an oversight to me, a mistake from him assuming that everyone hopping on now would carry over from American Idiot, and therefore listeners would know the basic core of his political messages and beliefs. That leaves the album feeling incomplete, like it skipped a huge chunk of message it could have dived deeper into. Why not dedicate a song about environmentalism? Why not a Black Lives Matter song, a song about gun control and mental health? If the politics are this important to him, why not just make his message clear? I only assume that maybe it didn't occur to him that he should, because even when writing, maybe he couldn't mentally separate this album from American Idiot. This album wants to depend on American Idiot to work with its ideology and with its messages, but it also wants to be something new, something separate, and something with its own musical styles and a lot of new directions. It wants it both ways at the same time, and ends up a little awkward. In movies and video games, there's an expression, show, don't tell. The idea is that events should happen on screen and in case of games with player input, so the audience can directly get invested in them. These events almost always hold more emotional impact and stay with the audience longer if they can be directly observed instead of talked about after the events. To me, American Idiot shows and 21st Century Breakdown tells. In Peacemaker, we don't see anyone being outlawed. We hear someone sing about being an outlaw. We hear about what the last of the American girls is like, but we never really see her act that way in any situation. We hear about how much our protagonists struggled living in Murder City, but we don't see any of the hardship of Murder City firsthand, except Christian crying in the bathroom and Gloria craving some cigs after a riot. I think the closest we get is horseshoes and hand grenades, but that still isn't specifically necessarily an actual fight, so much as a song going for the vibe of a fight. Apart from a few songs like those, the album is mostly themes or theory or ideology. Know Your Enemy, The Static Age, American Eulogy. These songs seem to have a lot of words to say about the society and America, but nothing to say about what Christian and Gloria are doing specifically in a tangible sense. 9 years prior on Warning, there's a song called Misery that's kind of the opposite of 21st Century Breakdown. The song spends zero time establishing settings and only a line or two introducing characters before throwing estate liquidations and murders and weddings at us. A lot happens in that song to people we don't really have time to get to know. But because of how short-winded and focused Misery is, I feel like it can say a lot more about its characters through its events. I get a lot more story and characterization out of the 6 minutes of Misery
than on all 70 minutes of 21st CB.
For these super deep dives, I usually just go through track by track, but I think stepping back and seeing 21st Century Breakdown as a whole is really useful in considering the larger collective issues on the album. If I had tried to bring those up as I was talking through every track, things would have lost focus really quickly. Sometimes an album's hurt by some bad songs, or bad flow, or bad mastering, but the issues I just described feel like cracks in a foundation, issues in the approach to the album itself that kind of reach everywhere on it. Still, the entire picture, the complete album, isn't just the effect the songs have together as a whole. An album's still a collection of songs, so I think it's worth taking a step back and seeing the songs for what they are too. And even though I value it highly, we'll tone down the focus on album flow for now. The title track might be the most tightly composed song on the album. Lyrics apart, it does a great job doing what Jesus of Suburbia did, if a little less intensely. Green Day capture a decent aesthetic of pop rock here, also because they can restrain that tempo down and let the guitar wander. The opening act is smooth and inoffensive, and in the transition into the second act, Armstrong's guitar work is some of the liveliest on the album, even if the other two members' performances are a little more box standard, and his vocals are the cleanest they've ever been, but still hold a bit of theatrical attitude. This is a great Armstrong song and reminds me of some of his solo work about a decade later. The closer is short and sweet and baits the listener in for more pretty effectively, and as a whole I wonder if this might have stood stronger as the opening track, though I need to know. The official lyrics are heroes and cons. And that's what it says on the album. But every single time I listen to the song, and every time some of my friends listen to the song, we hear heroes and cunts. Like there's a definite T sound there. Does anyone else hear that, or are we alone there? On the flip side is Know Your Enemy, a song with a slower but steady and hammering melody and guitar, kind of a spiritual successor to Holiday with its vibe, just more foot stomping and a bubblier approach to the guitar work. Though since it soars less high and the rhythm section's pretty unimaginative, it ends up a lot less riveting and plays with less life than the song before it, kind of feeling like the product of a song being placed in the album in the place it pretty much seems like it should work, because there were 45 songs and they had to go somewhere on the album. Know Your Enemy is a fun song, but it works its best as a first song. Its simplicity and the reliance on that repetitive guitar and chorus make it an effective attention getter, especially if you've been listening to a lot of pop or something else, but it's also about the most simplistic a song like this can go. And when it follows more developed songs, it can feel a little jarring. I think that's why Know Your Enemy is their go-to show opener. It's the perfect song for that, to get the crowd clapping along and build the energy and hype before blowing them away with a more classic Green Day song. Now that Know Your Enemy has gotten the energy up, it's followed by Viva La Gloria with a delicate, soft, high-pitched piano opening, which snaps into a fast, peppy, and hyper-bubbly pop-punk song with some theatrical vocals. The bass structure of Viva La Gloria is pretty effective. It's a fast and fun Green Day song not far removed from Dookie or Nimrod, but the guitar is muted and softened way more than it needed to be, and the vocals take up a lot of auditory space, despite not having that much presence in their performance. This track could go really hard and be some legitimately exciting, if familiar, Green Day pop-punk, but it plays it really safe and in ways feels more restrained than the title track. And following Know Your Enemy, it feels a little like it's afraid to be a hard hitter, because it doesn't want to upstage the song before it. The drumline is kind of tranquil on autopilot, so the rhythm section can't ground that shift in Armstrong's higher vocals and the overly smooth melody section, so in general Viva La Gloria feels a lot more subdued and sugary sweet than it probably needed to be. It feels like a weird direction for the song, a little like it did that just to feel different from similar tracks on previous records, more so than because this was the best decision for the song. Before the Lobotomy is one of my favorite tracks on the album, strictly because I think it captures some genuinely really good song progression, even tighter than some of the best on Nimrod and American Idiot. The intro captures both a nostalgic and a lost or confused energy, as the simple guitar work building throughout is perfect for what it is. Cool's drum work has some good timing, though it's instrumentally still mostly Armstrong's hour. The other members are at least succinct with his complete song. The jumps from softer to more intense guitar and percussion are effective, and all in all it feels like a song written with an understanding of composition and the importance of negative space and of silence in a song. The simple, cutting guitar parts weaving through the sound space aren't anything super groundbreaking or impressive on their own, but they fit well into the whole of the song. If the entire album was written as carefully and intentionally as this song was, I think it could have been really great. The harsher moments of Lobotomy admittedly aren't all that harsh, which works for what it does, but I think Christian's Inferno was supposed to make up for that by following it. Inferno takes the same framework as Know Your Enemy, a distorted, grungy, but still mostly clean guitar, an angry but theatrical attitude, and a simplistic bass section. Here kinda helped by the plain but at least energetic cymbal work. It aims to be harsher and more intense than Enemy, but rather than actually ramp up the intensity of the performance, it aims to be more snide and garbled in its verses, and contrasts that with the light, loud, almost doo-wop inspired chorus. Inferno isn't a bad song, but it's an incredibly simplistic 3 minutes. Simplistic punk songs can be a lot of fun, but are best taken in rapid succession and are usually helped by some off-model imperfection and endearing messiness, so this perfectly repetitive pop-like song structure and length doesn't mix with that energy very well. Inferno feels a lot like a first draft, the kind of thing that would have been worked down to a shorter song, or became part of another song, or was dropped in favor of another similar song that was more developed or more intricate. But for on its own, it's nothing terrible, and it can just overstay its welcome a little. Last Night on Earth is the song that most obviously shows its influences. It's hard for me to talk about it because I really don't dig the kind of music it's striving to be, so there's a roadblock here where I can struggle to tell if I hold an opinion about it because it's doing something wrong for what it's trying to be, or if I have that opinion because it's actually effectively miming what it's going for. The repetition and simplicity here that brought other songs down kinda lift this one up. It might not be the most effective way to compose a slower song, but I think it effectively works as a style of slow song that it wants to be, for the pros and cons that come with that. East Jesus Nowhere follows the same framework as Enemy, a distorted, grungy, but still mostly clean guitar, an angry but theatrical attitude, and a simplistic bass section. It aims to be harsher and more intense than Enemy, but rather than actually ramp up the intensity of the performance, it aims to be more boisterously sung, but audibly close and sharp in its verses, and contrast that with a spacious, sing-along, angry chorus. Nowhere might be my favorite song like these so far. Its guitar line is properly bubbly, but angry, kinda like what Viva La Gloria could have done, and while it's simple, the show-tunesy bass breakdown in verse 2 mixes up the pace and gives the song more character. All that said, it's a pretty simplistic and repetitive 4 minutes, and it feels a lot like a second draft, the kind that might have been developed from Infermo, but that still isn't all the way there. The simplistic songwriting of a 1 to 2 minute punk song stretched to 4 minutes is what really brings it down for me. That last guitar line feels like the payoff to a song like Last Night on Earth, and all in all, the song feels really janky, but not bad. The instrumentals at the core of Peacemaker are hyper-cliche. In ways it reminds me a bit of modern music, remix culture, in that it has a very played-out, overdone, simplistic core. But while more modern genres like that tend to be really self-aware, and use that to create an interesting contrast between the old and the new, Peacemaker feels more like it's just a one-to-one recreation of the pop culture concept of that genre, without any of that genre's actual nuance. I love when bands experiment out of their genre, especially with weird shit like folk music. But hearing this Latin European folk bubbled down to a spaghetti western sound is musically disappointing. There's certainly an argument to be made that the cliché could play into the narrative or the meaning of the song, but I personally think it would be best if that could be accomplished while still being a song with somewhat interesting instrumentals. It's very possible to make a satirical homage that's still endowed with the type of musicianship that a band usually puts out, and I'm not sure that Peacemaker does that. Last of the American Girls is another slow-burning song with a bit of that simplistic punk core, but it has the right idea to differentiate itself by peeling back to just a bass line and slowly building from there. It's another very repetitive song with a longer runtime, but the much more classic performance from Cool and the presence of a bass line that feels like Mike Dirnt wrote it, even though it is very simplistic, gives that self-driving, relaxed energy that Dookie and especially its B-sides were stuffed with. And I'd say quality-wise it ends up somewhere just below those. It's a chill, simple little track with minimalist instrumentation, and to me it works for what it is. But it's also squarely in that realm where if the simple little hooks just don't grab you, then it's probably a forgettable skip for you. There's a part of me that, lyrics and album flow and everything else aside, really loves Murder City and Little Girl for what they are. The composition doesn't stack to similar songs on the previous record, but Armstrong's is so competent with that smooth, theatrical, dramatic melody that at this point it's enough to get me at least a little invested. But a lot of the common issues return. An autopiloty performance from Cool, and very little presence from Dirnt. I know Dirnt's had wrist surgery and chronic issues, so I won't get too hard on him, but to me there's a difference between playing it simple and comfortable versus not really being audible. And while some of that obviously fails due to the mastering, I think the rest is mostly probably from the approach to bass writing, to a desire to stick with what Armstrong's doing. I imagine it might be hard to know what style of bass you should be writing when Armstrong brings a similar guitar style to a wide variety of songs on here, so he isn't really there for as much guidance for style, and since he keeps the lyrics private, it's probably even harder to feel that out. And I don't think it's a coincidence that the songs that are more confident about themselves in general also have more presence from Dirnt. Like Murder City, Little Girl is led by its theatrical atmosphere and that piano-esque melody, and its bass is formulaic, but at least it's more present than a lot of other songs. The flow and development between these two is reminiscent of Lobotomy, though a lot looser, and both songs carry on a little too long to truly match that energy, but these two songs I don't mind putting on sometimes. Even if Little Girl is pretty much Misery from Morning, just a little more generic, so it kinda works for what it is, at least more so than other songs on the album. I understand why some people love Restless Heart Syndrome, but it's my least favorite track by far. Mostly because it follows the structure and even some of the stylings of Give Me Novocaine, but replaces that interesting surfy energy with some of the most polished, clean, and nondescript pop rock ballad energy you could get on a Green Day album. And your enjoyment of Syndrome probably correlates strongly with your enjoyment of Billboard charting ballads. I guess the guitar payoff isn't bad, but I feel like it's done much better on Novocaine and on other songs, and it also could have served other songs on this album better. I recognize this language is a little loaded, so I'll be clear, I don't think pop music is inherently trash or anything, but it's popular because it's very familiar and musically inoffensive, and that meshes really weirdly for me with a punky aesthetic, like that guitar solo in the song. It's like pop punk is sweet and salty. They're opposite but complementary. But this is more like dill pickles and peanut butter. They're opposites and they really don't mesh together that elegantly. Horseshoes and Hand Grenades follows the same framework as Enemy. A distorted, grungy, but still mostly clean guitar, an angry but theatrical attitude, and a simplistic bass section. It aims to be harsher and more intense than Enemy, but rather than actually ramp up the intensity of the performance, it aims to be more boisterously sung and audibly sharp in its verses, and contrast that with a sing-along and hyper-poppy chorus. Hand Grenades follows the similar formula of the previous songs like it, though more than the others it feels like Enemy too. A very similar song, just a little angrier. It has the most bass presence of any of them, which is appreciated, but maybe also weaker percussion. The weirdest thing about these songs is probably how they're placed. If there was an album that was mostly like this, they'd probably feel a lot more cohesive. Okay, so you know when there's a punk or a hard rock album, then it's pretty kick-ass. It has 2 or 3 slow songs randomly jammed into it. Those are frequently there either because either the label or the band feared a more mainstream audience would lose interest without them. They're obligatory slow songs, usually compositionally decent, but nothing noteworthy and kinda out of place on the whole album. Thanks to their placement, these angrier songs feel a little like obligatory punk songs, scattered through their release to reassure that Green Day are still punk, and to keep certain listeners aboard. Again, not necessarily bad, but a little awkward. I usually don't like to get into comparing songs to their inspirations and into the inspiration versus plagiarism discussion, mostly because it's a discussion I'm not super interested in, largely because I think there's technically a little plagiarism in all art, especially within a genre. But it's really distracting for me in the Static Age, so I'll make an exception. On one hand, I can say it's probably my favorite song on the album, but on the other, the bassline and drum work are just a slightly poppier version of California Uber Alice, and considering that those are my favorite parts of the song, it's a weird feeling. I won't try to determine if what they do is plagiarism or effective as its own thing, especially with the admittedly really different guitar and vocals. I won't determine if it's transformative enough or not, I'll leave that up to you. But I think this illustrates the weird disconnected quality on the album. To have a literal 80s punk rhythm section tied to this hyper-poppy and overly bubbly melody, there's a bit of something that feels like intentional contrast or intentional dissonance, the same kind of thing at the core of all pop punk, but at the same time it feels like an iffy pairing of disconnected angles to the music. If the guitar allowed itself to go smooth and hard between moments of the song, instead of segregating itself to the smooth side and the rhythm to the rough side, it probably could have been a lot stronger. Let's take a breath and then power through the rest, because this album is really long and I think most of my points have been made. The next 2 songs are so much compositionally stronger than the rest that they feel almost like a tight EP at the end of a long, unfocused album. 21 Guns is slow and absolutely plays out an unfortunate part of the album, but it's effective for the reasons mentioned in the first part of the video. American Eulogy feels a little unfinished, like it's missing a first part and a last part, but the tightness of the song is a breath of fresh air at the end of this album. Armstrong's vocal delivery feels a little less overly polished and a little more emotionally authentic, and Dirnt's vocal section is almost perfect homage to proto-punk. I think it's the messiest moment of the story, but it forges a little emotional flow just through the instrumentation. The mastering seriously holds it back, but it's still a bit of a bop. And See the Light is a 4-minute finale that feels ripped from the book of 4-minute finales. It takes obvious influence from stage plays, but without a super clean story, so it's effective and soaring. Emotions ring a little weird, since they're just the instrumentation with less reliance on the vocals and lyrics. Despite the transitions throughout the album and the 3-act structure, the album's flow is pretty loose, going through the motions you might expect from the prior song and complementing the menace of the instrumentals. The metal narrative doesn't help with that, and by the end the energy of the songs kind of gives you an impression of a few acts and a climax, but what it really is and what it really built to, I'll leave up to you. I've never felt content with my past takes on 21st Century Breakdown, and I think that's because I always tried to limit myself to just one of the approaches I took here. I think that works for most albums, but there's a lot more to see and say about 21st Century Breakdown by taking this approach. I know it was really long-winded, but I wanted to give this album the fairest look I possibly could. To shift more to my preference, I don't think anything annoys me more in music than wasted experimentation. When a band is really close to figuring out something great, but doesn't figure out that next step to make that great. So to see a lot of interesting instrumental, political, and narrative ideas on here go mostly unexplored and assigned kind of substandard songs makes this the worst album for me. I'll take a weak album that knows what it is and just isn't going full steam over something so fundamentally confused about what it is that it throws away the potential it has as soon as it brings it up. I'll take a collection of underwhelming songs compiled together into a tighter, cohesive whole, greater than the sum of its parts, over something with good ideas and a few good songs that can't keep the quality consistent for very long. But that's not everyone's take. That's not what everyone's looking for in music. I have a few friends who rank 21st Century Breakdown as their favorite Green Day album, and one who pretty much considers it their favorite album, and I asked them about it and why they love it. And generally, they thought it was an imperfect and kind of messy album, but for them it was constantly those few songs with melodies or hooks or messages that they really, really loved that made the whole album worth it for them in the end. And I get that. This album has strong moments, bass lines, and guitar lines that I love here and there. 21st Century Breakdown isn't totally valueless. It has positive qualities, and I listen to a few of the songs on their own, and I like them almost as much as most of Green Day's catalog. But at the end of the day, I'm more of a big picture person. I like seeing intricate little things come together and add on top of each other to build a cohesive whole. And I think music might be the best artistic medium to showcase that kind of thing. And this album doesn't deliver that. The worst thing an album can do for me is fail to be an album, to end up as something that's best enjoyed as a handful of singles, and not as something more holistic than that. 21st Century Breakdown is one of only 2 Green Day albums that I don't listen through. 21st CB's composition is probably better than the other bottom tier record. Even if it's generic and loosely focused, it's still ambitious and that's a positive. But considering there are fewer songs here that I listen to on the regular, this one comes in as my least favorite Green Day album. Even removing the loaded expectations that come with the band name, I feel like 21st Century Breakdown fits pretty neatly with 5 or 10 pop albums that come out every year. It follows along a very common trend in pop music to pull off a few catchy and decently earwormy, possibly even great songs, but have an entire album that's otherwise just forgettable. It could be a lot worse. These albums are popular for valid reasons, but that's not what I'm looking for in music. And I think most people would agree that that's not the form of success that's necessarily the best kind for an album or band to aspire to have. Well, the furnace kicked on, so hopefully that's not too loud, but that's my take on 21st Century Breakdown. A little more measured take than my previous. I think that a lot of albums that aren't very good or that are generally considered bad are kind of uninteresting because they don't have a lot to learn from. You can pretty much just nail it down to 1 or 2 flaws throughout the album and leave it at that. Like, okay, this album is horribly overproduced and a little underwritten, and as long as you don't do that, you'll be fine, and that's all to really learn from it. But I think more than most bad albums, 21st Century Breakdown has a lot of learning potential from it. Part of me thinks that if Green Day could have let go of the idea of making a big grand concept album and either narrowed it down the songs that they had to a normal runtime album that was just focused on being a strong album, or maybe if they would have split up songs more by how they were written and maybe done something kind of like the trilogy, or a group of EPs or another side project or something like that, that they could have wound up and walked away with some more tight and better written songs. And that is probably the ambition to create another concept album that ultimately held it back more than anything. So I guess if there's a moral from 21st Century Breakdown, it's that it's okay to just write an album. Even if your last album was an ambitious and incredibly successful rock opera, it's okay to just write another solid album as your next album. The sunk cost fallacy is a real problem. Just because you spent a lot of time putting effort into something doesn't mean that you have to stick with it. And you can just put aside stuff that's not working and take a break and step back and come back and make something that does work, even if it took a lot of time. It's not a waste of time if the thing that you have in the end is better than it otherwise would have been.